All right, welcome back. This is going to be Macroeconomics, Chapter 8 on unemployment. So if you want to take out the notes I've provided and follow along after you've read the chapter, we'll go through the notes and we'll talk about some unemployment issues. Okay. Section 8.1, How Economists Define and Compute Unemployment Rates. It's important to understand how all of these statistics are defined, updated, upkept, maintained, etc., so that you understand sort of what's in the unemployment rate or what's in all of these statistics, right? GDP, unemployment. It's really important in building your foundation for economics to understand the major tools that are used, the major data tools. And so unemployment rate is going to be one of the huge ones. So in the United States, estimates run anywhere from 160 million to around 175 million employed Americans. So even when you see just a 0.1% change in the unemployment rate, say unemployment increases from 9.9% to 10.0%, that tenth of a percentage point is anywhere from 160,000 to 175,000 American lives. So keep that in mind, that just even very small fluctuations in the unemployment rate, a tenth of a percentage point means more than 150,000 Americans. And that doesn't even really talk about the number of family members and community members that are affected. So when someone is unemployed, children suffer, the elderly suffer, anyone who is a dependent of those people suffer, the community suffers generally, and your local economy also suffers. So unemployment can be pretty devastating, and really small fluctuations in the unemployment rate can have very large effects down the line, right? Because you get this multiplying effect. Remember that there's a difference between out of the labor force and unemployed, right? There is a vast chunk of the American adult sort of age to work population who isn't actually looking for employment, who don't count toward the unemployment statistics, right? So you have stay-at-home moms, you have some people who probably just like sort of run their own business from their home. These are people who aren't really unemployed. They don't have, say, a job, but they also aren't really actively looking for a job. So the unemployment definition, at least according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, is an individual without a job who is currently available to work and actively looking for work in the past 4 weeks. And this 4-week timeline is sort of a sticky issue, right? Because have you been looking for work for 4 weeks? How hard have you actually been looking? Have you dropped out? A lot of what happens, and we'll talk about, is those who are unemployed for more than 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, sort of long term, start to become very down on themselves psychologically, and a lot of times they'll just sort of drop out of the labor force. They'll be so discouraged, and they'll experience things like depression, and they'll simply drop out of the labor force. And a lot of times this can lead to mental health problems, suicides, things like that. So there are a lot of different moving parts when we talk about unemployment. Generally, the unemployment rate runs anywhere from about 5 to 10%. Excuse me, I got a little cold coming on. The unemployment rate runs from around 5 to 10%. The unemployment rate will never be zero, right? It's a theoretical impossibility, basically. You will always have some churn in the system. You will always have some firms going out of work, sort of declaring bankruptcy or closing up shop while others are opening. There's always going to be some natural churn in the system, and some natural unemployment is healthy. We actually want to see a healthy, approximate 4% unemployment rate. Because it means that people are making moves to better lives generally. It also means that people are often moving up into a new position. Maybe they're getting paid more money. So a small proportion of the population being healthily unemployed, and we'll talk about that, what is healthy and what is unhealthy, is actually a good thing for the economy. You don't want unemployment to be so low that people aren't sort of shifting into the economy, into better paying positions. You see what I'm saying? Okay. There are also some hidden unemployment types that the book discusses that, they're not all that important, but you should understand them in the sense that you need to understand what's inside of that sort of unemployment term. So you have dissatisfied employees. They don't count as unemployed, um, but they're not really employed the way that they would like to be, right? They only have a part-time job or maybe a temporary position, or maybe they're in the gig economy, which we'll talk a little bit about too. But they want full-time permanent work. They just haven't been able to find it yet. So they're not counting toward the unemployment statistics, but they're also not providing at that sort of production frontier. And so they're not 100% efficient. And so our economy is bearing the brunt and not working at full operation, right? You also have underemployment. And this is when an individual is trained or skilled for one type of job, and is unable to find that job, basically, right? So it's someone who maybe got, I don't know, an engineering degree in college and now is having to wait tables, or, maybe they work for the post office or something, I don't know. But they're highly underemployed, right? They are trained to be a highly paid and highly trained engineer, and yet they're waiting tables. So this level of underemployment, we're seeing more and more of this in the economy, as the economy sort of shifts towards almost all service jobs. And also with the glut of sort of college degrees on the market in the last 10 years or so. And then finally, we have discouraged workers, and these are those who have sort of just stopped looking for employment. And these are the people that we talked about above, the ones who have been, yes, they counted as being unemployed for a long time, but eventually they just get so fed up and frustrated that they sort of drop out of the system. And so they're not counted toward the unemployment numbers, but really they are unemployed. And so we're getting a false, rosy picture of unemployment, right? Because they should be counted toward those statistics, but because of the definition and because of their own personal behavior, they're not being counted, right? Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of what unemployment is and how we're tracking it, who counts toward each bucket, sort of, we should talk about how the data are collected. And there are two very important points that come out from the US government. And most of the established countries on the planet sort of have a mechanism for reporting these things. It's usually once a month, and then they'll also do quarterly reports, and then they'll also put together a semi-annual report, and then they'll also put together an annual report, and then oftentimes they'll put together sort of a decade report. But know that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics is in charge of the unemployment statistics, and they're in charge of a lot of the sort of the economic statistics in America. The Establishment Payroll Survey, the EPS, is the one that they put out that tells us, okay, this is how many jobs we created this month. And what they'll do is they'll break down the United States economy into regions and then even smaller little districts, and they'll randomly sample about 150,000 businesses and government entities. to try to figure out, what are the average number of hours worked? Have you added anyone to the payroll? What's your average salary? All of these sorts of things to try to determine whether, man, I am struggling today, whether companies are hiring or firing, right? And they'll do this on a monthly basis. They'll survey these businesses and government agencies. And so that gives us our job creation numbers. Now, the current population survey, the CPS, is the one that gives us our unemployment numbers. This is also created by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. They do the same thing. They break down America into about 3,700 different districts, and then they randomly sample households inside of those districts. And they try to wait for things like ethnicity and age and stuff to make sure that it's a nice random sample that's weighted correctly for demographics. But what they do is they call about 60,000 different households each month to determine what their unemployment rate is, when the last time they looked for work was, when the last time they worked, who are the other people in the household and are they working, do you have children, these sorts of things. Okay, and so these are two highly important reports put out by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. The EPS, the Establishment Payroll Survey, is all about job creation. The Current Population Survey, the CPS, is all about the unemployment rate. Okay? All right. Section 8.2, Patterns of Unemployment. If you look at this figure here, figure 8.3, you will see that unemployment vacillates pretty heavily over time, right? And there are some economists who suggest that the vacillations are getting wilder. So if you sort of look at the chart, the ups and downs are pretty small, right? In the 1950s and 1960s, they start to get a little wilder in the 70s, and then in the 2000s and 2010s, we're seeing massive swings with the Great Recession. So some economists are suggesting that not only does unemployment fluctuate because all of these sort of statistics fluctuate, but the fluctuations are getting wilder, and that we need to sort of concern ourselves with the magnitude of the fluctuations, because it could start to get pretty devastating if these get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. The next number of graphs, they just want you to see that there are vast differences in unemployment rates over time for different demographic groups. Males and females generally track together. Males in the last 10 years or so actually have a more difficult problem with unemployment than females. Males tend to be the first to go in normal times. I think the current trend in the pandemic is that women are actually seeing their jobs be lost faster. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens when the new data comes out. Data usually is about a year to two behind because of the massive undertaking that calling and tabulating and analyzing 70,000 household surveys entails. So I really think that we're going to buck the trend a little bit from what we've seen with women losing their jobs a lot faster than men, at least under the pandemic auspices. If you look at the next one, this is figure 8.4b. These are age groups, and you see that the older you are, the more likely you are to be employed. Those who are 16 to 19 or 20 to 24, oftentimes they're in transitory positions, right? We were working at a movie theater, or you're working for your dad, or you're working for, some convenience store or whatever. It's a job you don't care about and that you don't really want to keep necessarily for the long run. You also have a lot of other responsibilities. You got sports, you got school, you got college. So it makes sense that that younger people are going to be unemployed more often, and we'll actually talk about why that is and why that is in foreign countries where the youth unemployment rate is exorbitant, like 30, 40, 50%, and it's causing problems in some of these societies like Tunisia, um, even in some of the European countries like Portugal and Spain. This is causing major issues with the frustrations that are sort of bubbling up for the youth, because the elderly have jobs and they're not losing those jobs, um, even if they're not good at them because of the way the laws are structured. And companies are unwilling to hire new employees because of the fear that they'll never be able to get rid of them if they suck. And so there's a lot of seething frustration amongst this unemployed youth in many of these countries. All right, the last one, figure 8.4c. This is a peek at the demographics of the United States. You can see that white individuals, and I'm guessing Asians would probably be there as well, have the lowest level of unemployment. Hispanics are next, and then blacks have the highest level of unemployment in America. A lot of this has to do with the sort of history of slavery, Jim Crow in the South. So hopefully these things are sort of changing a bit in modern times after the sort of Black Lives Matter movement and some of the, I guess, wokeness that we're seeing in modern America. Um, but in general, ethnic minorities have much higher levels of unemployment than white individuals in America. I also wanted to show you a cross-country comparison. So this one isn't from your book. This next graph, the bar chart, this is actually a graph I got off the Bureau of Labor and Statistics website. And it's really interesting. We can compare these developed countries and how their unemployment rate looks over time and compared with other countries. I would note that unemployment is measured slightly differently in other nations. Not everyone has agreed to the same exact definition or limitations, etc. It is something that some broader international data management organizations are working on, but there's no agreement yet. Right, and so most of the first world, at least, agrees on how we measure these things, but even within the first world, there are slight differences. So, Japan tends to have the lowest unemployment rate across the world, almost always, right? Japan and South Korea. Germany is up there. The United States is up there. And then if you look down at the bottom of the list, you have nations like Italy and Spain who have laws that make it really difficult to sort of fire or get rid of employees. And so there's a lot of fear of hiring new employees. So once you get someone off the books, a lot of companies just start hiring a new person, especially amongst the young. So Spain and Italy are having real problems with unemployment. I would have you note here that there's no easy answers, right? It's not like all the market economies have low unemployment and all the quote unquote socialist economies have high unemployment, because Germany is arguably a socialist economy, as is South Korea, who top the charts, whereas Spain and Italy are on the bottom of the charts. So it's not really, that's not the answer. Um, it's not really about development either. Um, I'm not really sure what the answer is, honestly. There's not an easy answer to be found from this chart. I would suggest that a lot of it has to do with the laws on the books about firing and hiring, about pensions, about whether a company has to pay out a severance package, these sorts of things. So there really, like I said, there aren't easy answers about, okay, well, obviously the market economies work better than the sort of the more socialist economies, but there's not a lot of evidence for that there. Okay, moving on. Section 8.3, what causes changes in unemployment over the short run? All right, and the short run, we're going to talk about sort of healthy unemployment, and this is cyclical unemployment. This is the variation of unemployment that the economy causes moving from expansion to recession. So, when firms are always looking at what does the future look like, right? Because they want to make good investments. They want to be able to ramp up or slow down productivity given what's going to happen with economic trends. They want to do their hiring and firing based on economic trends. So when a firm thinks that the economy is going to expand, they'll generally start to hire more. When there are concerns about recession, they'll start laying people off, right? But here we have a puzzle. The whole book so far, we've been assuming that labor works by the laws of supply and demand. But that's not necessarily true, right? If labor does work by the laws of supply and demand, then why don't wages ever drop on average? I would also say wages don't really rise in America anymore, but they also don't drop during recessions, which is puzzling because if these things work out like we're suggesting they do, like the market, and they're just simply based on supply and demand, lower demand will lead to lower wages, right? But that's not what happens in the system. So, there are quite a few possible answers that economists have provided over time. Possibility one, those unemployed should be willing to work at lower wages but are simply holding out, right? If they're unemployed, they should be willing to just go work at the gas station or McDonald's or whatever, even if they used to make $40 an hour. The market suggests that that's the job that they can get, and so they should take it until they can find something better. And this is probably part of the solution, but it's not even really close to the majority of the solution. From what we found from economic studies, this just isn't, it's not a very likely explanation for what's happening. The possibility two, wages are sticky downward. So this is the idea that wages can rise, but it's really hard to convince all of your employees as a group to take a wage cut, right? And which is something that we do not see in the American system, or really in any system. And so they're trying to explain why. Why is it that we can't just cut wages across the board to try to get through hard times and then raise them when we get back into the good times? So why is that? Suggestion A is the implicit contract. And this is the idea that workers and their employers have this sort of quiet, unspoken contract between the two of them that you will pay me a little less in good times so that you don't cut my job in bad times, right? And I think there's a little bit of this as sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, like, yeah, maybe I should be making just a little bit more, but you're not going to just dump me when things go wrong. But I don't know. I don't know that this has a lot of plausibility on the massive scale, right? Then we have efficiency wage theory. This is the idea that employers or firms have an advantage in paying just a little bit more than the going market rate to their employees to keep employees highly productive and to avoid having to continuously pay for training and onboarding. And the theory is that if you do pay these people a little bit more than sort of the market wage, They'll be more likely to stay at your company because they know they'll be paid less at a different company. But I kind of call bullshit, because if all firms are thinking the same, then they're all going to want to pay you a little bit more than market price. And then that becomes market price. And so, how could I leave you if this other firm also is going to want to retain me by paying me a little bit more? Like, it just doesn't make sense, right? So, I have a real big problem with this efficiency wage system, efficiency wage theory. It doesn't really seem to pan out in the real world. Like I said here, I mean, it's really problematic. If all companies behave similarly, then their whole theoretical foundation drops out. I would note, however, that onboarding and training costs are extraordinary, and the company does have an incentive to keep you on. Now, is it because of efficiency wage theory? I do not think so, but I also do think that they made a good point about the costs of onboarding and training, which can be really, really high. The next theory is adverse selection of wage cuts. It says if you start cutting the wages of your best employees, they're the most likely to leave. So if you cut wages across the board, like they're suggesting would happen under the auspices of a supply and demand curve, if you just cut all of your employees' wages by 8% or whatever, the idea here is that you're just going to lose your best employees, the ones who are able to shift away to a different firm and get back their salary. Now you're just stuck with sort of the dregs of your workforce, and nobody wants that, right? So I think that this is a better explanation than the other two so far. And it really helps to explain the sort of trimming behavior by companies rather than across the board cuts. Finally, we have the insider-outsider model. This sort of touches into some of the other ones. The idea that is that the company or the firm will want to keep the insiders at the company, right? Those who have already been trained and onboarded and are vital to the everyday functioning of the firm, and that the outsiders, the ancillary employees, are going to be the new ones, are going to be the ones who aren't very tenured, and they're going to be in sort of ancillary positions that aren't main positions to the everyday functioning of the firm. Okay, section 8.4 is the last section. What causes changes in unemployment over the long run? So these are less healthy, right? So we talked about sort of the short-term unemployment, cyclical unemployment, the idea that that unemployment is happening naturally with sort of the ups and downs of the economy, right? It's natural, it's healthy. Unfortunately, there are a lot worse unemployments. We have, number one, frictional unemployment, which is also a healthy unemployment. This is sort of just the natural unemployment that occurs when people shift from one job to another. Really natural, really healthy. You want a little bit of this because it means that there's movement in the system, hopefully upward movement. So this is healthy unemployment. However, structural unemployment. This is unemployment for those who don't have jobs because they lack the skills valued by the labor market, either because demand has shifted away from those skills or because they never learned any skills. So these are just those who are left behind in the economy, basically. Structural unemployment is very, very bad. And the government, I believe, has a role in helping to ameliorate or reduce the amount of structural unemployment in the system. This is going to be a big concern as we transition away from the fossil fuel industry and toward green technology. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of people who worked in the petroleum industry who now need to be trained and re-jobbed, basically. And so this is where I think the government has an incentive and even a responsibility to step in and help these people through training and through job placement programs to ensure that they don't just simply get left behind because their skills are no longer demanded, right? And I think that this is a possible paper here, if anyone's interested. What role does the government bear in ensuring that this doesn't occur, and how can it be either completely avoided or ameliorated if it does happen? So, okay, we're going to talk a little bit about public policy too. This is my favorite part. Um, we should talk about welfare a little bit if we're going to talk about unemployment. There are positives and negatives to welfare. The negatives, of course, is it can simply reduce the incentive to look for work, right? Especially in some of the European countries where some of their welfare states are, will provide unemployment benefits for 3 to 4 years. A lot of people think that that's a bit too much, right? And so you need to find a healthy balance of, yes, we're trying to protect the individual, we're trying to help protect the society, but we need to incentivize you getting back into the workforce, right? So there's a tricky balance to be found. The positives of welfare benefits are that they can really help keep the economy moving. If we're not thinking about just the individual and whether they're, trying to bilk the system or whatever, even if they are trying to bilk the system, at least the economy is still rolling, right? At least they're still spending money, they're buying food, their children aren't starving, their elderly and disabled sort of dependents aren't hungry, they're being taken care of, they have health care. A lot of times what happens too is that unemployment causes mental illness. And it can cause violence, especially against those who are most vulnerable, like children, the elderly, and the disabled. So, some of the positives of this public welfare system are, again, that it can just help keep the economy moving. It helps keep the economy from grinding to a halt, and it can reduce the violence and the negative externalities that sort of trickle down the line, right? It's not just about the individual who is now out of work. It's about their children. It's about their disabled relatives. It's about their dependents. If that single mom now is off of unemployment and we cut her off completely, it has devastating effects on the economy, but it also has devastating effects on those kids. Now they don't know where their next meal is coming from. They can't learn properly because they're not getting the right nutrition, which is going to cost us economically in the future, right? Because they're not going to be well trained. Their brain won't have developed correctly. They are not getting the education that they're going to need to be a future contributor to the economy. So these things have really, really long-term building effects, okay? Research suggests that placing a medium-term time limit on everything except for food and healthcare is a good way to incentivize reentry into the market. Make it legally obvious that, okay, you get 6 months, or you get 9 months, or you get 12 months. The literature suggests that it needs to be medium term, right? Not long term, not years. But not, just a couple of months either, because it takes a while to get back into the labor market. It takes a while to find a job and go through the interview process and maybe have to move to a new part of the country. So usually anywhere from 6 months to a year is the sweet spot from what I've seen in research. Why food and healthcare? So why you might cut off the unemployment benefits themselves eventually after, say, a year or whatever it is. But why should we continue with food and healthcare? There are a few reasons for this. First of all, is healthy children learn better. We talked about this a little bit, and we need those healthy children to provide to our future economic and not simply be a drain and a welfare contributor in the future, right? Food has a local multiplier effect, and this is some really interesting research coming from, what is his name? Paul Krugman, and some others of his ilk. They are finding that the spending in food stamps or EBT or whatever you want to call them, this actually has a multiplier effect on the local level, right? So a lot of times what's happening is, first of all, none of this food is going into a bank account, right? It's not just going to sit there and become savings. It will be spent. It has to be spent. You can only spend it on food. And so it's going into local grocery stores, which goes to the local farmers, and then that money turns around and goes to the local tractor, the local tractor distributor and parts. And so you get this huge multiplier effect that doesn't really happen with just cash handouts. When it's food, it trickles down the line to multiple spots, helping a lot of different people in the local economy. And then finally, you can't work if you're unhealthy. And this is something that we're finding across the board, is that if countries don't ensure that their people are healthy, then they're going to have problems in their economy, because unhealthy people cannot work and they end up being a drain on the system. Not only can they not work, but they're also more likely to be pulling money out of the social services and the social safety net system. So it's sort of a double drain, right? You're getting that opportunity cost from them not being in the labor force, and you're getting a cost from them taking out of the coffers of the state. So food and healthcare are really vital. Food for sort of the disabled and the children, for our future production. Healthcare so that we have a healthy workforce that can go back to work, right? Let's see. Oh, I would like to mention that some states are starting to implement what's called UBI, and this is a universal basic income. I don't know if anyone paid attention to the sort of the Democratic debates, not the presidential debates, but the Democratic primary debates. There was a candidate named Andrew Yang, who was very interested in this UBI concept. The idea that you just send a check to every adult in America or every adult in your country. Some countries are trying this out, and they're finding that it can have real effects on poverty, especially for children. And what the idea is that you just send a basic minimum payment to every single person in your country. And so for the hyper rich, they're still going to get their $1,000, but they're paying in a lot more in their taxes, right? And so this helps to sort of reduce the cost of trying to figure out, okay, who gets this and who doesn't. Let's not figure that out. Let's just send $1,000 to every single person in the country every month, and then you'll have to pay it back on the back end in your taxes anyway. So what does it matter? But it helps to ensure at least a lowly standard of living for everyone in the country, and this is really helping to reduce childhood poverty, disabled poverty. It's even helping to reduce things like violence against children and violence against spouses, and things like child abuse and child molestation. So there's a lot of mental illness that is tied into poverty, and so these things can help to ameliorate that stuff. All right, I think we're going to cut it there. Thanks for sticking with me. Everybody have a great day and stay happy and healthy. And I will get the last one up today, I hope. Have a great day. Bye.